Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are doing something a little different today. Well, not totally different, but we're going deep, deep, deep.
Deeper than we normally go.
Exactly. You know those times you get totally engrossed in a book and wish you could just hang out with a scholar and get all the juicy background info?
Oh, all the time?
Well, that's what we're doing today. It's a deep dive into Pride and Prejudice.
Mm.
But hold on. We're not just rehashing the plot. We've got the Cambridge edition.
Oh, it's fantastic. All the annotations, the essays, the historical tidbits.
It's like Pride and Prejudice with scholarly footnotes. So, get ready, because we're about to uncover all sorts of hidden depths. I'm talking things even a diehard Austen fan might not know.
You know, it's funny because most people think Pride and Prejudice is just a charming romance. And it is, but there's just so much more going on underneath.
Okay, so set the scene for us.
Yeah.
What can we learn from a deep dive like this that we wouldn't get from just reading the novel on our own?
Well, for one thing, Pride and Prejudice isn't just a love story. It's a window into the very specific world that Jane Austen lived in. England during the Napoleonic Wars. And Austen wasn't writing about some vague historical past. This was her contemporary world.
Okay, so how does that war actually play into the story? Because I'll admit, when I read Pride and Prejudice, I'm mostly focused on the romance and the witty banter.
Sure, but put yourself in the shoes of a young woman in Austen's England. War is going on, soldiers are everywhere, and there's this uncertainty about the future. It adds this whole other layer of tension to the romantic drama.
I see what you mean. It's not just about finding a husband.
Right. It's about finding stability and security. And even more than that, Austen's own life was touched by these conflicts. Her brothers were in the Navy, so this wasn't just an abstract thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So these things were personal to her.
Very much so. And you see it reflected in the novel, subtly, of course, like the militia being in Meryton, where the Bennet sisters live. That's directly tied to the war.
So those dashing officers weren't just there for the girls to swoon over.
Nope, not just for swooning. Their movements were dictated by, well, military strategy. In fact, scholars have actually used these details to try to pinpoint the exact year the novel takes place.
Really? How do they do that?
By comparing the militia's movements to historical records, like peace treaties, troop deployments, all that stuff, it's almost like a historical puzzle.
That's really cool. And speaking of puzzles, what about that entail on Mr. Bennet's estate?
Mm-hmm.
Most readers probably see that as just a plot device to create urgency for the sisters to marry well.
Oh, it is so much more than that. The entail reflects a real legal system, a system of property inheritance that was in place in Austen's time.
So like a legal thriller element in Pride and Prejudice.
In a way, yes, but seriously, can you imagine not being able to, sell your property or leave it to your daughters?
No, that sounds crazy.
That's the entail. It was locked in, destined to go to a male heir, even a distant one, like Mr. Collins. So, Mrs. Bennet's obsession with marrying off her daughters, not just about social climbing.
It was about their survival.
Exactly. And what makes it even more interesting, Mrs. Bennet brought a substantial dowry to the marriage, £4,000.
That's a lot.
But because of this entail, their future was still very precarious.
It really makes you see Mrs. Bennet in a new light, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Pride and Prejudice is so much more than just, oh, will they, won't they romance. It's about social status, economic realities, and the impact of these big global conflicts all woven together.
It's amazing how much depth Austen packed into what seems like a simple story.
Right. Oh, and speaking of depth, there's that scene where Mr. Collins is trying to impress Elizabeth, and he starts reading from Fordyce's Sermons to Young Women.
Wait, that was a real book.
Yeah.
I always assumed it was just like a funny detail Austen made up.
Nope. Sermons to Young Women, a real book. It was a conduct book, a guide for how young ladies should behave.
Let me guess, it didn't age well.
Not really. By Austen's time, Fordyce's views were getting a little outdated, even mocked. So by having Mr. Collins, the most awkward character.
Champion these ideas.
Exactly. Austen was subtly making a point.
That's so clever. So we've got war, money worries, and changing social norms all swirling around in Pride and Prejudice.
It's all there.
This is making me want to reread the whole thing, like right now. What else is there to uncover?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. This Cambridge edition, it actually connects Austen's writing style to, are you ready for this? The structure of a Mozart concerto.
Wait, Mozart, okay, now my brain is doing backflips. How does that even work?
Well, think about it. A concerto, it builds tension, then releases it, with a beautiful melody. Austen does the same thing with her characters and the plot. Conflict, misunderstandings, And then resolution.
So she's orchestrating our experience as readers.
Exactly. Oh, and here's another fun fact. Did you know there were two more editions of Pride and Prejudice published after the first one in 1813?
Really? I had no idea.
Yep. And Austen had zero control over those later editions. The publisher made changes like correcting errors, but also adding things.
So the Pride and Prejudice we all know and love might not be exactly as Austen intended it.
That's a big question. It really makes you think.
My mind is blown. I can't wait to dig into even more of this. This is incredible. All right, so where do we even begin after all of that? We have uncovered so much already.
Well, we could switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about something that seems, well, kind of purely romantic at first glance. The planned trip to the Lake District. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, the trip that never actually happens.
Exactly. But that's not just a random vacation idea. You see, in Austen's time, the Lake District was like this trendy tourist spot.
Really? Why? Was it like the Bath of the North or something?
In a way, yeah. It was all because of this thing called picturesque beauty. People were obsessed with finding landscapes that looked like, paintings.
Wait, so there was a trend for how scenery should look?
Yes. Dramatic mountains, rugged ruins, you name it. It was like the Instagram filter of the 18th century. People were obsessed with capturing these picturesque views.
Okay, so not your typical English garden stroll then.
Definitely not. And get this, there was actually a writer named William Gilpin. He literally wrote the book on picturesque beauty, like how to compose the perfect view. And his work was like super influential.
So when Elizabeth Bennet is all excited about going to the Lake District, she's actually being, super trendy.
Exactly. And even the language she uses to describe the trip, it aligns with all the fashionable vocabulary of the time. Austen is being very clever, showing us how even something as simple as admiring a view is shaped by these bigger cultural trends.
Wow. Austen really missed her calling as a trendsetter.
Right. Okay, but let's go back to those sermons to young women for a second. I'm still curious about what they actually said.
Oh, yeah, me too. What was in these sermons?
Well, Fordyce, he covered all sorts of topics like obedience to husbands, the importance of modesty, basically the whole, how to be the ideal wife thing.
Yeah.
But as we said, by Austen's time, these ideas were starting to be challenged.
Yeah, it makes it even funnier that Mr. Collins is the one reading them.
Right. Total cluelessness. But it shows, that Austen was aware of these changing attitudes toward women's roles. Don't forget, this was the era of like Mary Wollstonecraft. She was writing about women's education and independence. So Pride and Prejudice, it's playing out against this backdrop of change, this shift in social norms.
It's amazing how much is packed into this book. I never would have thought about all these layers before.
And there's more. Remember we talked about those scholars trying to figure out the exact year the novel takes place, using like the militias movements and stuff?
Yeah, it's like detective work.
Well, there's another detail like that. Mrs. Bennet's dowry, the £4,000, that's a huge amount for the time. But the Cambridge edition points out that Elizabeth would only inherit like £40 a year after her mother's death.
Well, wait, so where did all the rest of the money go?
That's a really good question. Did Mrs. Bennet spend it all? Was it invested badly? We don't know for sure.
So it's like a mystery within the novel.
It is, and it adds this whole other dimension to the story. Think about it. If Mrs. Bennet knows that her daughters aren't going to be well off, it makes her desperation to marry them off even more understandable, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. It's not just about being pushy. It's about, like, securing their future.
Right. And it also shows how important financial savvy was, even back then. It's a theme that still resonates today, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Okay, so we may never solve the mystery of Mrs. Bennet's missing fortune, but it definitely makes you think. But we can't forget about the romance, right?
Right.
Even with all this historical and economic stuff, Pride and Prejudice is still, at its heart, a love story. And this Cambridge edition makes this really interesting comparison.
You were talking about the Mozart thing?
Yeah, the Mozart thing. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but the introduction says that Austen's writing has a similar structure to a Mozart concerto.
And it actually makes a lot of sense. Think about how a concerto works, right? You have these contrasting elements, these moments of like light and shade. Austen does that too. She balances these moments of humor with sudden bursts of emotion, satirical observations, with these tender moments between characters.
So it's not just about the words on the page.
No, it's about the experience, the way Austen is playing with our emotions. She builds tension, then she releases it, just like a composer. It's why Pride and Prejudice is so endlessly rereadable. There's always something new to discover.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Okay, so we've got historical clues, money mysteries, social commentary, even musical parallels. This is incredible. What else is in this Cambridge edition?
Well, there's one more thing, and this one is kind of a bombshell, you could say. You see, Pride and Prejudice, the version we know and love, it might not be exactly what Austen intended.
Wait, what? How is that possible?
Remember how we talked about those later editions of the novel? The ones Austen had no control over, the publisher made changes?
Oh, yeah.
Well, some of those changes were more than just correcting errors. There were additions, things that Austen might not have liked.
So the Pride and Prejudice, in
Yeah.
my bookshelf, it could be like a corrupted version.
Well, corrupted might be a bit strong, but it's definitely something to consider. The text we read today, it might not be exactly what Austen envisioned.
Wow. That's a pretty huge thought. It makes you wonder what Austen would think if she could see, how her work has been interpreted over the centuries.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even the classics, even the most beloved ones, they have this really complex history, a history that's shaped by, well, publishing practices, changing social norms, and of course, by readers.
It's so interesting to think about. It makes you realize how much we take for granted. You know,
Yeah.
we just assume that the books we read are exactly as the author wrote them.
Right. But it's not always that simple.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this deep dive. Wow, so much to think about. I'm still kind of reeling from all these Pride and Prejudice revelations.
It is remarkable, isn't it, how much depth and complexity there is.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
like we've been watching Pride and Prejudice in black and white all this time, and suddenly, bam, someone handed us the colorized version.
Yeah.
And speaking of seeing things in a new light, I was especially intrigued by that mystery about, you know, Mrs. Bennet's missing fortune. Did we get any more clues about that?
Well, not really. The text doesn't give us any, definitive answers.
Right, right. But that's part of the fun, isn't it? I mean, it gives us something to ponder. So what are some of the possibilities? Where could all that money have gone?
Well, one possibility, maybe Mrs. Bennet just, spent it all.
Yeah, I mean, she does love those parties and all those fancy clothes for her daughters.
Exactly. She's very concerned with appearances. So, over the years, it's possible those expenses just kind of, well, added up.
That makes sense. It's
Yeah.
not like she's known for being, thrifty.
Right. Another possibility, maybe the money was invested poorly. Don't forget, this was before, modern banking and all that. So people lost money all the time through risky ventures or just plain bad luck.
So maybe Mr. and Mrs. Bennet weren't as well off as they seemed.
It's a possibility. And it would definitely add another layer of tension to the story. I mean, imagine if Mrs. Bennet knew her daughter's future wasn't so secure. Her desperation to marry them off becomes even more understandable.
Oh, totally. It's not just about being pushy. It's about protecting them, trying to ensure their well-being.
Sure. Exactly. And it highlights the importance of, well, financial literacy, even back then.
Yeah, that's a theme that's still so relevant today, isn't it? Okay, so maybe we'll never know for sure what happened to Mrs. Bennet's dowry, but just the fact that it's mentioned, it's just another example of how much thought Austen put into her work.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of details, there was another thing I wanted to mention, the description of Pemberley,
Ah, Pemberley. Mr. Darcy's grand estate.
the place where Elizabeth starts to see him in a whole new light.
Right. I mean, Pemberley represents everything Elizabeth wants, wealth, stability, taste. But I was surprised to learn that Pemberley isn't just a fictional creation.
That's right. Austen drew inspiration from real estates, from her own experiences.
So it's not just a setting, it's a reflection of her world.
Exactly. And it adds another layer of meaning to Elizabeth's visit. She's not just impressed by Darcy's wealth, she's connecting with a world that's part of Austen's own heritage. It's very subtle, but it's there.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. It makes me want to go back and reread that whole section. It's amazing how much deeper our understanding of the book becomes when we have this kind of, scholarly information.
It's like unlocking a secret code, isn't it?
Totally. And that's the power of a deep dive.
Hmm.
We're taking something familiar and revealing these hidden depths, these connections to history, to social trends, to the author's life. I mean, it's just incredible.
And it reminds us that even the most beloved classics, they have these layers upon layers waiting to be explored. Pride and Prejudice, it's not just a love story. It's a reflection of a world that's both familiar and, well, a little bit strange.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Absolutely. There's always something new to discover.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Pride and Prejudice. I have to say, this has been a real eye-opener.
I agree.
And for anyone listening who thinks they know Pride and Prejudice, well, think again.
There's always more to learn.
As always, happy reading, everyone.